Welcome to the sixth and last lecture in a series by Professor Wesley J. Wildman on the general topic of religious experience from the mundane to the anomalous. The series is part of a research project in the Center of the Study of Religion and Psychology at the Danielsen Institute at Boston University, funded by the Meta-Nexus Institute, which is supported by the John Templeton Foundation. My name is Robert Neville, and I'm the executive director of the Institute and principal investigator of this project. Professor Wildman is associate professor in the Philosophy, Theology, and Ethics Department of the Boston University School of Theology, where, among other things, he directs the doctoral program in Science, Philosophy, and Religion. He took a bachelor's degree with first-class honors in mathematics at Flinders University and a graduate degree in divinity from the University of Sydney, both in Australia. He completed a PhD in philosophical theology and systematic theology and philosophy of religion at the Graduate Theological Union at Berkeley. Since coming to Boston University in 1993, he's published a large book, Fidelity with Plausibility, and edited with Mark Richardson a collection of state-of-the-art debates on issues in religion and science. He was also the co-editor of the Encyclopedia of Science and Religion. He's published over 60 articles in theology, ethics, and religion and science, many of which have come out of collaborative group projects, such as those of the Vatican Observatory Group and the Boston University Comparative Religious Ideas Project. Currently, he has 7 volumes about to appear. Religious experience is a topic on which Professor Wildman has researched, taught, and written for the last decade or more. Please join me in welcoming him to deliver this evening's lecture, Make It Start, Make It Stop, Religious and Spiritual Experiences and the Long-Range Future. Professor Wildman.
Well, hello. Thank you for coming out this evening. From the beginning of human history, there have been technologies of religious and spiritual experience. This lecture is about the form these technologies are likely to take in the near and longer range future, assuming continuous growth in scientific and cultural understanding. The varied aspects of religious and spiritual experiences are increasingly coming under human control. We are not only able to measure them, describe them, distinguish them, and evaluate their social functions, behavioural consequences, and health effects, we are also more and more able to start them, to stop them, to regulate them, and even exert control over interpretations of them. In fact, our understanding of and technological control over religious and spiritual experiences is accelerating rapidly. Capacities for control that today come to us only in dreams and nightmares, in science fiction and fantasy, will in short order be familiar aspects of life. The future is the best context in which to raise the question of the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences. This is because it frees us from the delusion that those experiences lie somehow beyond human control and understanding due to putatively supernatural origins. A proper awareness of the technologies of religious and spiritual experiences, past, present, and future, injects a sober realism into our account of their meaning and value. Now, in the past, technologies of religious and spiritual experiences were of 3 overlapping kinds: botanical, social, psychological, and meditative. First, botanical techniques were based on human exploration of the plant environment and the discovery that some plants produce altered states of consciousness and health effects. Knowledge about psychoactive plants and their likely physical and mental effects was recorded in oral traditions and passed down the generations, often from older experts to younger apprentices within shamanic or medicinal traditions. Corporate rituals developed around plants with psychoactive properties, perhaps as a way to regulate their negative side effects and to control potentially disruptive religious interpretations of the resulting altered states of consciousness. You just can't have a whole group of people wandering around unregulated, consuming shrooms. Second, psychosocial techniques involved leveraging corporate commitment and enthusiasm to produce desired emotional states with religious and spiritual significance. This could include everything from rhythmic chanting and dancing to group fasting, from risky acts of hunting bravery to surviving extreme physical initiation tests, and from gorging at feasts to sexual frenzies. Just as botanical techniques could be used both for healing and for spiritual purposes, so psychosocial techniques could be used for inspiring togetherness prior to a battle, for promoting dissociative states that may have health benefits, and for achieving religious and spiritual ends. Third, meditative techniques derive from the fact that some individuals can deploy thoughts, actions, postures, foods, and surroundings in various combinations with concentration or focused attention or relaxation to induce desired states of consciousness. Some of these states could induce changes in behaviour, mood, and consciousness, physical and mental health, and some could be so illuminating and moving that they were said to have profound spiritual significance. Meditative techniques that proved to be widely effective were shared, practiced, refined, and encoded in traditions. Now, the reason these three overlapping spheres of technology surrounding religious and spiritual experiences are so widespread and ancient within human cultures is that groups of human beings will inevitably encounter them. We need to eat, so we must explore the possibilities for food and medicine afforded by our botanical environment. We have to function in groups, so we spontaneously explore the space of psychosocial possibilities. And each of us struggles to understand and control our own thoughts and feelings, and so we naturally explore the space of psychological possibilities. In all three areas, as we explore, we also inquire, we investigate, learning from successes and failures, detecting patterns, drawing inferences about causation, and formulating promising new hypotheses to test. These three types of technology remain important today, and they will remain important in the future. But why each is important and the way each one is important changes dramatically as scientific understanding discloses the causal architecture that links religious and spiritual experiences to their existential potency, to their social functions, to their behavioural consequences, and to their health effects. These changes have been notable in the last century, during which religious and spiritual experiences have been the object of scientific study, and especially dramatic in the last decade or so, with the rapid increase of knowledge of neurophysiology, neuropsychopharmacology, and the neurology of social behaviour. It appears that we are not near the end of this period of rapidly expanding knowledge about religious and spiritual experiences, but rather close to the dawn of a research-based transformation in our understanding. This transformation will place into our hands refined control over religious and spiritual experiences that has been unthinkable in past generations. In what follows, I shall discuss this dawning transformation, first in relation to these three long-standing types of technology, and subsequently in relation to unprecedented technologies that our growing understanding of these experiences makes possible. I shall then raise the vital question of the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences in light of these considerations about technologies of control. Finally, by way of ending both this lecture and the series of lectures that it brings to a close, I shall look back over the entire journey and draw out some culminating conclusions about religious and spiritual experiences. So let's start with botanical technologies. Humans and other animals get drunk from fermented fruit fallen from trees. Some foods are poisonous. Brackish water makes us ill. When there is any confusion about the effects of foods, we can compare reports from multiple sources and use trial and error, if we are brave enough, to find out which food is responsible. Our sense of taste guides us to foods that contain all-important glucose, which was extremely important in certain parts of human history, but it also draws us to explore the marvellous world of tastes. Our enjoyment of food leads us to explore more widely, in search of foods with special powers, perhaps, that are more important to us than how pleasant things taste. All species explore their botanical environment for food, Human beings do so in a more systematic and experimental way than other species, and we have been doing it for thousands of years. It is in this way that, thousands of years ago, in the uncharted past, human beings discovered foods that induced altered states of consciousness, replete with religious and spiritual significance. These foods are known as entheogens, and are the naturally occurring or artificially manufactured chemicals that have similar religiously relevant psychoactive properties. That is, the word's used not just for the botanicals that gave rise to the word, but now also for artificial chemicals that produce similar effects. The botanicals producing these effects were recorded, as I've said, in the oral lore of medicinal and shamanic traditions. Medical anthropologists and ethnobiologists have identified hundreds of plants believed by ancient cultures to have mind-altering effects. Here are a few well-known examples, well-known partly because they've been in the news in the last few years. First, the peyote cactus has been used for millennia in medicinal and ritual practices among people native to the southwest of the North American continent. The cactus is best known for its specifically religious use within the so-called Native American Church, which has been the subject of protracted legal battles over its religious rituals involving a brew made from the cactus buttons. You might know Houston Smith, the renowned religion scholar who championed the Native American Church and went out there and tried peyote. And his report of that experience was chiefly that it just made him sick and nothing happened. But apparently if you hang in there through the sickness, things can happen. Second, the fungi psilocybin mushroom has a multi-millennial history. It was made famous in recent times by Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert, who founded Harvard University's psilocybin project in 1960. The formal research project ended under a cloud within a couple of years, and the two men were fired from the university in 1963 after a publicity scandal and a state investigation that was never completed, since I gather it produced the desired effect, the firing of the two men. Third, ayahuasca is a vine widespread in the Amazonian rainforests. By itself, it is not psychoactive because the human digestive system breaks down the psychoactive chemicals quickly, rendering them harmless or neutral. When combined with certain other plants, however, the breakdown of ayahuasca's psychoactive ingredients is prevented, it's inhibited, and the resulting brew can be extremely potent. Many other plants have similar properties, including certain acacia trees in other parts of the world, as noted in an earlier lecture. The many recipes for ayahuasca brews is a good example of the deliberate experimentation needed to produce potent medicines, and thus an indication of how differently skillful shamans might have been. Some probably could have produced strong brews on a regular basis, and others would have produced duds. If you've got to know what to do, you've got to know how to make them. Several contemporary religious groups use one or another form of the ayahuasca brew in religious rituals, including Santo Daime, you probably know how to say that, but I don't. Does anyone know how to speak Portuguese here? Daime, I think it's Santo Daime, which integrates shamanistic elements with Christianity. Santo Daime was founded by Mestre Ireneu in Brazil in the first half of the 20th century and has since spread to many parts of the world. The use of ayahuasca in religious rituals has been the subject of numerous court rulings in the past 2 decades. So all of these have been legally contested practices. The difference between the past and the future in regard to botanicals is the scientific discovery of the precise psychoactive chemicals that produce the entheogenic effects, and thus give us the ability to determine better than ancient shamans could precisely how to produce an effective and also safe dose from the botanicals in question. For example, we know that peyote cacti are rich in mescaline, among other things, and we know what dosage of mescaline produces a strong psychoactive effect, between 300 and 500 milligrams. Thus, we can avoid the unpleasant bitterness of the peyote brew and the associated vomiting if we so choose, and we can manage dosing safely by ingesting mescaline directly. I'm going to be using phrases like that a lot in this lecture. I don't want you to understand any of this as actually commending to you the taking of drugs. I'm simply talking about possibilities in the future. Currently, as you know, many of these drugs are thoroughly illegal. Again, we know that the psilocybin mushroom's active ingredient is psilocybin, though there are also a few other psychoactive tryptamines in that mushroom. Psilocybin is broken down during digestion into the psychoactive alkaloid psilocin, which is structurally similar to serotonin and probably affects serotonin receptors in brain synapses. And with regard to ayahuasca, we know that the main active ingredient is N,N-dimethyltryptamine, which is called DMT for short. This small psychoactive chemical is broken down very quickly by monoamine oxidase, or MOA. So DMT has to be ingested along with MOA inhibitors in order to ensure that DMT survives in the digestive system enough to get into the bloodstream and eventually into the brain. Psychedelic researcher Rick Strassman argues that the human brain actually has receptors in its blood-brain barrier that specifically draw DMT through that barrier. He also argues that DMT is endogenous, being synthesized in the pineal gland. This is the sort of information we had that I suspect shamans of the past would love to have had. Knowing all of this shows us what is dangerous about these plants and also precisely how they should or could be used for cultivating religious and spiritual experiences. Unregulated use of these psychoactive chemicals can be dangerous, which is why governments ban them. But religious groups have successfully argued that ingesting traditional brews made from the plants themselves should not be illegal. We have something else that ancient shamans lacked, namely a rich comparative database of psychedelic experiences. We know the different qualities of the hallucinations produced by various psychoactive chemicals. Hallucinations can be hugely different in their quality. We know the conditions under which ingesting them produces positive versus negative experiences having to do with set and setting. And we know which chemicals enhance feelings of community and so on. Lots of different effects for lots of different chemicals. This database is a vital resource for neuropsychopharmacology and helps guide researchers in their quest to understand neurotransmitter functions in the human brain. That is, even people who are not the least bit interested in religious and spiritual experiences use this information to guide their studies of neurotransmitter functions. Despite the near cessation of psychedelic research, after all, most of the ones that were being studied are currently illegal, this body of knowledge can play a role in customizing and controlling religious and spiritual experiences using various botanicals better than ever in the past. And it's happening. Lots of groups are doing it. So let's move on to psychosocial techniques. For a long time, human beings have instinctively understood that rhythmic music and lighting in intense group contexts can be hypnotic, inducing susceptibility to suggestion and surrender to dissociative states. These experiences can liberate us from tired conventions, they can bond us closely to others, and they can catalyse commitment and courage. They can stimulate bodily changes that alter the conditions for mental and physical health. They can render people psychologically fragile, and they can change beliefs and behaviours more or less radically. In our time, it is not only rock music concert designers and nightclub planners that know about these things. Most rapidly growing religious movements make use of such techniques to facilitate conversion to a favoured religious outlook. Now, these techniques are rarely deployed in religious contexts specifically with the aim of cynical manipulation. Typically, religious leaders believe in the spiritual significance of those experiences at least as much as the participants do. It seems crucial for everyone involved to be able to attribute the religious and spiritual experiences that occur in such settings to the work of spiritual powers, of enlightenment or divinity. Because understanding how psychosocial conditioning operates in such settings might interfere with being able to make that attribution to supernatural powers, religious leaders de-emphasise those conditioning effects, and they offer theological rationalizations for the ways that they organise such social gatherings. For example, we sing repetitive songs while swaying and holding hands and looking deeply into one another's eyes. Why? Well, not to induce semi-hypnotic suggestibility, of course, but to worship God. So they de-emphasise the social, psychological effects and conditioning, and they emphasise the theological rationalisation. We dance around flickering firelight all through the night. Why? Well, again, not to induce semi-hypnotic suggestibility, but to summon the spirits. The music and hand-holding and swaying, or the rhythmic dancing and flickering lighting and booming drums are represented not as causes, but as the tools of supernatural powers. These theological interpretations are so persuasive and pervasive within a group that people rarely even become aware of the physiological aspects of the emotions and thoughts they have in revivals or in firewalking episodes or snake handling churches, right? Not understanding how embodied human brain works in group settings helps to conjure a veil of mystery around these experiences, and this makes more compelling the ruling theological interpretations of the effects that arise. Now, such psychosocial techniques are unquestionably effective. In fact, if you want to convert people, you can just take what I've said here and start a movement, and I promise you it will work so long as your message is interesting and you're actually interested in people. But they are not so universally or overwhelmingly effective that they could not be made more potent through careful research and by customising sensory experiences to individual backgrounds and brains. In fact, as I understand it at the moment, rhythms and lights and music and togetherness are coarse tools in the way they are usually deployed, and they are capable of significant refinement. Loud noises are painful to some people. Rhythmic movement does not work well for people with arthritis. Flashing lights make some people nauseous, and some people grow anxious in crowds. While the precise kinds of rhythms and lights that work best for most people are not currently well understood, it is conceivable that the sensory conditions most likely to render an individual susceptible to suggestion will be understood much more clearly in the future. And that specific psychological tests, such as blood tests and brain scans, could disclose individual variations quickly and easily. Currently not possible, in the future very likely. The result would be the possibility of a customised social environment for hosting religious and spiritual experiences. So imagine this. Picture a socially intense religious gathering 50 years from now, something like a Billy Graham crusade or an evening with the Dalai Lama, but with a twist. The advertising describes the event as a customised religious experience in a diverse group of loving fellow believers, more realistic than holodeck theatres, and more meaningful and coarse forms of human togetherness such as live sporting events and music concerts. Upon entering, each person signs an informed consent document and is quickly analysed using a microscopic drop of blood and a brain scan. These non-invasive and painless procedures happen in mere seconds, and the analysis allows a program to set optimal sensory parameters and physical location within the auditorium. The guest then moves to an assigned high-tech seat that is automatically programmed with the appropriate parameters. The location of the seat and the unobtrusive sensory equipment in the seat adapts the experience of the event to the individual's specific physiological profile. The result is an individually customised social religious experience. It takes optimal advantage of whatever capacity for suggestiveness, learning styles, and neurological distinctiveness exist in every single individual within the auditorium. In this environment, the music and public addresses and lighting and surroundings produce an optimally potent religious and spiritual experience. People leave the event stronger than ever in their religious beliefs, confident in their moral orientation, happier and healthier, and determined to live more wholesomely and compassionately. They came understanding the technology involved, and they were hoping that this would happen. They willingly paid the entrance fee to support this important religious event and to make use of the technology for their own purposes. And they returned home satisfied and inspired. Now, at this point, we should also pause to consider the possibilities for abuse of these kinds of technologies. Such abuses can arise in the transition period when some people understand these technologies and others do not. Differential understanding creates opportunities for economic and political exploitation. It always has, and it always will. For example, people may not know that the organisers of a social event or the promoters of subliminal message advertising are taking specific advantage of them with the aim of influencing their thoughts and behaviour. In due course, however, presumably most people would know how these technologies work and would accept them and their regulation as ordinary parts of social and religious life. Abuses can also arise even when everyone knows how things work, and yet technologies of religious and spiritual experiences are deployed as means of explicit social control. In that case, a host of miserable scenarios arises, some of which are depicted in dystopian novels such as Aldous Huxley's Brave New World and George Orwell's 1984. We are right to worry about mind control because it is a reflexive temptation to which those seeking to gain and protect power easily fall prey. Such control can be enhanced using customised psychosocial techniques to manipulate suggestibility, particularly in a religious framework. The dystopias that could result from this go beyond even what Huxley and Orwell imagined in their disturbing futurist nightmares. So there's something to guard against. Now, meditative techniques. Despite extensive research into meditation, which we've touched on in earlier lectures, there are numerous open questions. In particular, what varied effects on consciousness can different types of meditation produce? What are the biochemical triggers and accompaniments of those effects? What key brain regions and functions are implicated in particular meditation effects? Unfortunately, the comparative meditation database linking techniques and effects on states of consciousness is far less developed than the botanical database linking plants with consciousness effects. But it ought to be possible in principle and in practice to construct such a database using existing correlational data. We've heard already in other lectures about Christella's multimodal scheme of meditation effects and Benson's relaxation response. And there's also traditional knowledge about particular styles of meditation and the types of cognitive and emotional effects that they produce. That's actually the richest source of information. While that database is being built, another that links meditation styles to neurochemistry and neural activation sites is also being enriched. Before many decades have passed, it will be possible to picture the following scenario. Imagine in 2 or 3 decades coming across a web advertisement for biofeedback enhanced meditation experiences. You know that biofeedback has been used in stress management, lie detection, pain management, and other applications. But the ad explains that a wealth of information about the physiological effects of meditation now make possible a new type of biofeedback that reduces the time required to master a meditation technique from decades to hours. The ad points out that traditional meditation practitioners have been protesting this turn of events, claiming that a decades-long cultivation of meditation skills is the only authentic approach. But the ad likens this attitude to a refusal to fly across oceans in airplanes in favour of the traditional method of rowing. The traditional meditation student is immediately lost in the forests of the mind. There's almost no relevant guidance to help them direct their meditation efforts. Almost all are confined forever to the domain of low-level changes of consciousness, and only a few lucky students manage to get much further, thanks to inbuilt feedback mechanisms that allow them to make purposeful modifications in their concentration during meditation. But now, the ad insists, you can have the same benefits that these special brains offer their lucky hosts. Through the miracle of the biofeedback techniques, joined with advancing knowledge of the physiology of meditation, you can use externally generated information about the state of your embodied mind, information that you cannot produce internally through introspection, to guide your meditative practice. The ad invites you to think of regularly visiting a biofeedback meditation location near you in the same way that you think of going to the gym. Both are about fitness. When you arrive for the first time, what will happen? Why, you'll be asked to select one of 24 meditation styles, each of which is associated with particular biochemical neurological characteristics which permit biofeedback, and each of which is also associated with particular typical outcomes in terms of states of consciousness and behavioural changes. Expert counsellors will be on hand to help you make this vital decision. Once you know what you want, you will be situated in a beautiful and comfortable location where non-invasive equipment is used to produce the relevant biofeedback. Your task is then to deploy the biofeedback information with the aim of training your mind to produce the target state of consciousness. You will have to work hard, like every student of meditation, but you will no longer be guessing about what works and what doesn't. You will no longer be constantly overwhelmed with frustration. At last, you can have the information that you need to make the most of your brain's ability to produce transformative states of consciousness. 3 decades. Now, unprecedented technologies. We've tried to picture the future of familiar technologies of religious and spiritual experiences, the botanical, the psychosocial, and meditative technologies that have been important in human cultures for millennia. But there are new technologies that offer unprecedented levels of control over states of consciousness, pointedly challenging traditional understandings of the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences. In previous lectures, we discussed the claim of neuroscientist Michael Persinger and others that stimulation of the brain using targeted magnetic pulse fields from outside of the cranium might be able to induce specific types of religious and spiritual experiences. Presumably, this type of extracranial stimulation technology could eventually become more precise and powerful than it is at present. But I shall focus in what follows on neuropsychopharmacology, using laboratory synthesized psychoactive chemicals with known as well as unknown effects on brain and behaviour. We saw already that neuropsychopharmacology can isolate the psychoactive ingredients within entheogenic plants, thereby potentially assuming the role that these botanicals have played in human civilizations to this point. But neuropsychopharmacology also goes well beyond this. The human brain, like other animal brains, saves space by using overlapping circuitry. This is not immediately easy to grasp because our normal models of electrical circuits have only one transmitter of electricity, namely electrons. And distinct circuits do not interpenetrate. That just causes a disaster and then the circuit doesn't function properly. But the brain is quite different. Though the brain's neurons send electrochemical signals along their length in much the same way regardless of the type or location of neuron, the interface between the axon of one neuron and the dendrite of another, called the synapse, uses numerous chemical transmitters, not just one. Not like electrical circuits. Because of this, the synapse functions as a kind of switch, allowing some kinds of signals to pass while blocking others. Thus, the very same neuronal architecture can contain numerous active circuits, and the very same neuron can participate in numerous circuits, depending on which neurotransmitters are active and which are inhibited. This ingenious system saves space, as I've said. It also allows for intricate overlaps between neural systems. This is one reason why mapping brain circuitry is so difficult and why conscious experience is so interesting. It's why synesthesia is possible, for example, when you might hear the things you see or smell your visions, you know. It's why memories can be entangled with behaviour in such complicated ways, so that there are reflexive, instinctive responses, behavioural responses that you really don't understand and requires decades of therapy to sort out. There are several ways in which neurotransmitter activity can be affected, all based around the neurochemistry of neurotransmitter release, reception, and reuptake. Here are 5 of the most common ways to affect neurotransmitters, with examples related mostly to entheogens. First, a neurochemical can stimulate the release of a neurotransmitter from an axon terminal. This happens with MDMA, or ecstasy, which prompts the release of the neurotransmitter serotonin. Second, a neurochemical can dock with receptors thereby stimulating a neurotransmitter's function even when the neurotransmitter is missing. This happens with DMT, mescaline, psilocybin, all mentioned above, and also with LSD. Each of these chemicals simulates the effects of the neurotransmitter serotonin. Third, a neurochemical can inhibit the breakdown of a neurotransmitter, thereby allowing it to remain active in the synapse where normally it would disappear more quickly. This happens with the MAO inhibitors that I mentioned earlier, which prevent the breakdown of monoamine neurotransmitters, as well as neurochemicals such as DMT, thereby enhancing DMT's effect on, once again, the serotonin system. Fourth, a neurochemical can block receptors in several different ways, so that the appropriate neurotransmitter function cannot be performed and the signals are blocked. This happens with PCP, which docks with receptors for the neurotransmitter MDMA and prevents MDMA circuits from functioning as they would normally. Fifth, a neurochemical can inhibit the reuptake pumps on the axon, thereby leaving those neurotransmitters active within the synapse for longer than would otherwise be the case. This happens with SSRIs, or selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are a common antidepressant medicine. By the way, the first that was artificially designed and produced. They prevent the reuptake of serotonin and thus leave serotonin active within the synapse, where it can change mood and sometimes produce entheogenic effects. Now, the brain maintains a strong defence against the many and varied chemicals in the blood. This defence is called the blood-brain barrier and consists of tightly packed cells in capillaries within the brain. This system effectively blocks most chemicals, only allowing those for which there are specific transport mechanisms to cross over into the brain. Of course, some molecules can diffuse into the brain despite the blood-brain barrier's defences because they are so small, but most need an invitation. The blood-brain barrier poses problems for administrating psychotropic substances in general. It's a big deal in psychiatry, for example, including those with entheogenic effects. But new techniques using nanotechnology are starting to make the blood-brain barrier technologically tractable, traversable more or less at will, by binding target medicines with lipid molecules that basically slip in through the blood-brain barrier so that you can deliver the chemicals. This may be one of the most important transformations in the neuropsychopharmacological technology of entheogens. Now, already at this point, neuropsychopharmacologists know which chemicals both enhance and suppress many neurochemical systems by virtue of operating on specific receptors and any one of the dozens of neurotransmitters. They have some grasp of the dangers also, including especially addiction, modification of synaptic receptor density, and structural damage to the brain. These are non-trivial things. Mess with the brain, you can pay a price. You know the old ad? Here's your brain, it's an egg. Here's your brain on drugs, it's a smashed egg. It's not for nothing that many psychotropic substances are illegal to possess or consume. Most importantly, they have a lot of information about the kinds of effects that can be expected from modifying neurotransmitter functions. This database at this point is getting very, very rich and complex. So, picture a new breed of spiritual director. This time you only need to go 20 years ahead. This new type of specialist blends the analytical insight and the prescribing authority of the psychiatrist with the spiritual sensitivity of the traditional spiritual director. Let us call this person a neurospiritual director. Once spiritual goals are set with a client, a neurospiritual director can advise that client to make use, say, of neuro-customized psychosocial experiences of the sort that we talked about earlier, or maybe to explore biofeedback meditation exercises in the biofeedback gym around the corner from their apartment. Or they might recommend magnetic brain stimulation therapy, or maybe, heaven help us, conventional psychotherapy. They might also augment such recommendations, however, with a medication regimen designed to facilitate desired goals. For example, a client might present with difficulties trusting and cooperating with others due to a persistent inability to achieve a normal level of empathy. This problem is devastating, leaving the client feeling lonely and spiritually empty. The neurospiritual director might prescribe a course of low-dose empathogens such as MDMA derivatives or oxytocin that are well suited to compensate for natural difficulties with empathy and to stimulate awareness of the degree to which most people normally feel partially attached to others. The memories of those empathic experiences while on medicine get seared into the client's mind, and they can be used within a therapeutic process permanently to produce behaviour changes toward the end of realising the client's goal of greater empathy and social connectedness. Alternatively, a client might present as religiously tone-deaf, firmly believing that the doors of their spiritual perception capabilities are locked shut and covered with dust, and yet they just long to open them. They long to cleanse the doors of perception, to use Aldous Huxley's phrase as modified by Houston Smith. The neurospiritual director in this case might prescribe low doses of an entheogenic hallucinogen, not one that produces visions and auditions bearing no relation to experience, as some hallucinogens do, but rather one that enhances the emotional richness and perceptual texture of ordinary experience. The experiences from this short course of drugs would be accompanied by intensive therapeutic discussions of the significance of seeing ordinary experience in a much more intense way. And all this would be complemented by biofeedback-guided meditation exercises that can make this richer type of experience a more consistent part of the client's everyday life. Well then, let's turn to meaning and value of these experiences in technological perspective. We have discussed a host of ways that the role of religious and spiritual experiences in our lives might develop in the future, all things being equal. At this point, I want to step back from these reasonable speculations and attempt to draw some conclusions about the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences in light of these technological scenarios. I shall mention 6 such conclusions here. First, these future technological scenarios suggest that affirmations of the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences often have silently depended on ignorance. Explanations of meaning and value have silently depended on ignorance of neural and psychosocial workings. Many of these affirmative interpretations have relied on supernatural accounts of the origins and mechanisms of religious and spiritual experiences. When we discover the technologies that allow us to start, stop, and regulate such experiences, we naturally wonder, well, why do we still need hypotheses about supernatural causes and mechanisms? And to the extent that we assigned meaning and value in the past to religious and spiritual experiences based specifically on their supernatural origins, we may feel foolish and conclude that they have no value after all. The lesson to be learned here is that we should not commit to an interpretation of the meaning and value of these experiences that might make us uncomfortable or to slip into denial about eventual discoveries concerning how they actually work. If we can't cope with the causality as it becomes clear to us, if we find ourselves having to deny it or tell ourselves stories about it, then clearly we're not being completely honest and forthright with ourselves. Second, knowing the mechanisms of religious and spiritual experience need not interfere with people's willingness to claim cognitive reliability, moral value, and existential authenticity on behalf of such experiences. I've tried to give examples that indicate how you could positively claim experiences for the purposes of spiritual projects and religious projects that you define for yourself with others. This is true even when technologies of the sort we've been pondering are deployed to trigger such experiences. There are many thoughtful people whose religious and spiritual experiences strike them as colourful and cognitively deceptive side effects of a big brain cognitive system, but who still think they're exquisitely valuable. The analogy here is wonderful food and glorious music. They're evolutionary side effects of our neurological makeup. I mean, we weren't selected to appreciate violin sonatas or, pate. But we don't need to claim that we're adapted for religious and spiritual experiences in order to produce a persuasive argument on behalf of their meaning and value. If we can have these wonderful side effects like food and beautiful music, then why can't religious and spiritual experiences also be wonderful side effects? If it turns out that we actually are adapted for religious and spiritual experiences, and that currently is an open question in the research literature, then the case for the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences has to be framed differently. But in either situation, a strong case can be made. So the bottom line is, just because you know how things work doesn't mean that you have to abandon claims to the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences. Okay, let's suppose that we get past the shock of realising that ignorance has often supported positive assessments of the meaning and value of these experiences. Let's also suppose that we are fully aware that both positive and negative cases can be made about their meaning and value. To what criteria can we appeal when deciding on the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences? How can we settle the argument? This question raises several other conclusions. Numbers 3 through 6. So, third, the more the mechanisms of religious and spiritual experiences are understood, the more we are rationally obliged to relate judgments of their meaning and value, their authenticity and reliability, to deliberate, regulated deployments. We cannot attach significance to spontaneous, unsought occurrences. You see, it's very common for someone to report a mystical experience and to attach enormous significance to the fact that it struck them from nowhere, just hit them out of the blue, completely unexpectedly. That's a sign of its authenticity. This linkage between spontaneity and significance merely masks ignorance again. Ignorance of biological and psychosocial causes. So we have to refuse to uphold it. If we cannot attach meaning and value to religious and spiritual experiences that we ourselves induce in any of the ways discussed in this lecture, then we should not attempt to attach meaning and value to such experiences based on their apparent spontaneity. Fourth, the more mechanisms of religious and spiritual experiences are understood, the more judgments of their meaning and value depend on effects, and the less those judgments depend on their causes. This is a case of by your fruits you shall know them. No matter how religious and spiritual experiences come to us, what they produce in our lives is what matters most. You see, that causes a shift. Once you can control them, once you can turn them on, turn them off, regulate them, then the way they come to you can't be what's most important. It's the effects they have that must matter most. Fifth, an integrative interpretation of religious and spiritual experiences in relation to everything we know about religion and the sciences, about human nature and the spiritual depths of life, it's crucial in any argument on behalf of their meaning and value, their authenticity and their reliability. These integrative interpretations must link up the many relevant components of our knowledge into a persuasive causal narrative that explains how the neural embodiment and social embedding of these experiences relates to our moral choices, to our value judgments, and our behaviour. Now, in these 6 lectures, I presented one such integrated interpretation. It's very sad that in the literature of religious and spiritual experiences, there are so few at the current time. There's so many disciplines involved, so many different pieces to put together to try and create a plausible causal story that we actually do not have good examples of a full-blown multidisciplinary justification of the meaning and value of these experiences. That, I presume, will change in the coming decades. Sixth, these integrative interpretations are most plausible when they do not require supernatural agents with special causal powers. Now, our speculations about the future of religious and spiritual experiences drives this point home forcefully. Supernatural agents were once thought essential for explaining and causing these experiences, but we have no need of that hypothesis any longer. By itself, this does not rule out supernatural agents. It's important to point that out, because we can still say that those agents spark religious and spiritual experiences through the processes whose causal mechanisms we are learning to trace. When we choose to do biofeedback meditation, God cooperates with our choice, or the spirits cooperate with our choice, or whatever it might be, and cause special things to happen. But an hypothesis of this supernatural sort comes to seem increasingly exorbitant and implausible when it is repeatedly shown to be superfluous for explaining the causes, the meaning and the value of religious and spiritual experiences. So now the conclusion. This is a sort of lengthy conclusion because it's taking on a larger job, summarising just this, the whole series of lectures, not just this one. But it's intelligible just based on what you've heard today. Now, looking ahead to the future, to an era when the biological and psychosocial mechanisms of religious and spiritual experiences are well understood, prepares us. It prepares us both for what confronts us in the present and for the more intricate technologies of religious and spiritual experiences that will be with us in the not too distant future. I have tried to show that thought experiments about the future of religious and spiritual experiences help us detect the criteria that matter when we try to decide questions of their meaning and value, authenticity and reliability. In concluding both this lecture and the series of lectures I've delivered this academic year, I want to draw out a major theme that has surfaced repeatedly and to present an argument about it. The theme is supernaturalism. My argument is two-sided. On the one hand, our growing understanding of religious and spiritual experiences makes supernatural worldviews increasingly implausible. On the other hand, naturalist worldviews are eminently supportive of arguments on behalf of the meaning and value, the authenticity and reliability of at least some religious and spiritual experiences. Supernaturalism is a slippery term. In this context, I mean the word to refer to a worldview that posits disembodied beings such as demons and angels, spirits and ghosts, deities, major and minor, all with disembodied centres of consciousness and awareness and cognition, and possessing causal powers that operate beyond the regularities of nature and yet can interfere and intervene in this world. That's what I mean by supernaturalism. You will find other definitions out there. I'm trying to be quite precise about what I'm talking about. These entities are the heart and soul of religious narratives by which the majority of people guide their lives. And these entities are also understood to be the objects and causes of some kinds of religious and spiritual experiences. According to supernatural worldviews, it is through our capacity for these experiences that communication and interaction can exist between embodied creatures like us and disembodied beings of the supernatural sort. Now, I have presented in these lectures a many-sided argument that the more we understand the causal mechanisms of religious and spiritual experiences, the more supernaturalism of the kind I've been describing seems like a fairy tale. A fascinating but finally unbelievable framework for interpreting our lives. Supernatural beliefs derive from evolved cognitive reflexes that are useful for survival but also lead us into cognitive error. These cognitive reflexes include pattern recognition, cause detection, intention attribution, and our fondness for minimally counterintuitive beliefs. I've talked about those features of human evolved cognition numerous times in previous lectures. But cognitive error is merely the tip of the iceberg of supernaturalism. In other words, it's not just wrong. As we use supernatural worldviews to explain the world, we also unconsciously make unquestionable the moral frameworks that support social life. And in this way, we can evade responsibility for our moral decisions. As we attribute bad and good events to supernatural powers, we imbue those events with meaning, but we also avoid coming to terms with the real causal factors operating behind the scenes. For example, we can say that it was God's will that our child died of dysentery, in an understandable attempt to handle the unremitting pain of such a tragedy by attributing it to supernatural divine action. But in taking this approach, we may fail to notice that the dysentery was a direct result of poor public health in our community and was in fact a thoroughly avoidable tragedy having a lot more to do with economic injustice than with divine providence. As we learn more about how the world works, we are better able to take our fate into our own hands and thereby prevent future tragedies of this kind. And we become less interested in deflections and evasions of the sort that supernaturalism seems to make inevitable, particularly when enshrined in religious doctrines and practices. We still need meaning in our lives, but we no longer require supernatural narratives to sustain that meaning. Excuse me. You may put that down to supernatural intervention to prevent you from hearing the next paragraph. An apt analogy for this transformation in understanding is Western medical care in the last century or so. As recently as 100 years ago, Western mainstream medical practices were often shrouded in mystery, which makes so ironic and condescending the attitude of Western medicine to other medical traditions. Anyway, that's another story. The stories that now seem strange to us we routinely use to explain how things went wrong in the body and why certain bizarre treatments were supposed to work. Leeches, for example, which actually were useful sometimes, but not as often as they were used. People routinely relied on supernatural ways of thinking to understand their illnesses and their recoveries. Since that time, virtually everything we know about the biochemistry of life has been discovered, from cellular metabolism to protein functions, from the roles of bacteria and viruses to the immune system and psychopharmacology. While medicine is still far from perfect in diagnosis and treatment, in the West as well as elsewhere, most Westerners trust mainstream Western medical treatments precisely because of its extraordinary effectiveness. They no longer need supernatural narratives about health and disease, even if they still use them. They still need existential courage and spiritual meaning when illness strikes, as ever, but they can get this without having to invoke a world of spirits and supernatural causes if they so choose. Many Western people combine the naturalistic system of Western medicine with supernatural narratives and healing techniques, of course. But they don't have to do that, and there's no denying that shift. I contend that our rapidly growing understanding of religious and spiritual experiences will induce the same kind of shift. Just as with disease and medical treatment, supernatural accounts of the causal origins of religious and spiritual experiences will become steadily less plausible as such experiences can be produced on demand, as we can start them and stop them. And the meaning of those experiences will become increasingly tied to their consequences rather than to the sheer fact of their occurrence. Moreover, people will become less credulous about the cognitive content of their religious and spiritual experiences, knowing that they are socially conditioned and never transparently self-interpreting events. Yet, even as supernaturalism necessarily becomes less plausible in the presence of a detailed understanding of the mechanisms underlying religious and spiritual experiences, our need for existential meaning, our need for moral orientation persists. So our interpretation of religious and spiritual experiences will shift as well. From what? From a supernatural encounter model to a naturalist engagement model. Supernatural encounter to naturalist engagement. That is, more and more people will want to give up the idea of religious and spiritual experiences as serendipitous encounters with supernatural beings who send us inspiration and information and interventions to help guide our lives. Instead, they will understand their religious and spiritual experiences as forms of engagement with the wondrous and dangerous and morally ambiguous depths of natural reality. In this new world of understanding, people withdraw strength from religious and spiritual experiences, not because they confirm the existence of a supernatural world beyond this one, but because they testify to the beauty and complexity of the world they treasure and strive to enrich every day of their lives. They will derive moral orientation from those experiences not because they convey moral commands from supernatural beings in a position to boss us around, but because those experiences help them to detect the good and the true in the beautiful in the world around them. They will find meaning in religious and spiritual experiences not because of what they supposedly reveal about other spiritual worlds, but because they open up the value-laden depths of this world. It is through engaging the depths of nature that we can understand and feel its depths, internalise the stunning vision of our natural environment that its value structures and intense flows reveal, and thus decide how to comport ourselves in relation to it. For the naturalist, these only ever partially plumbed depths of nature are the true referent of religious talk about God and salvation, liberation and enlightenment. Properly understood and carefully disentangled from our cognitive biases, from our cognitive reflexes. I'll start that sentence again because it's so important to me. When we understand those experiences properly, and when we carefully disentangle them from our cognitive reflex to construct supernaturalist explanations, then these experiences are the means by which we become aware of this profound spiritual reality that defies the grasping tentacles of religious understanding. One of the avenues by which we learn to engage that reality with every fibre of our beings, if we so choose. Now, this new world may not be fully with us for decades or even centuries, but it is coming as surely as the sun rises. And it is available right now for those who have the eyes to see the dawn. There are things to fear about the new day, and many adjustments in religious self-understanding will be required. But there are also great virtues. Religious and spiritual experiences will always be with us because that is our evolutionary birthright. The question before us now, and increasingly in the years to come, is whether we require ignorance of the workings of religious and spiritual experiences to appreciate their meaning and value. If we do require ourselves to be ignorant, then we will resist new knowledge with a fury born of desperation, commensurate with the catastrophic failure of supernatural worldviews. Or we will reject both supernaturalism and religious and spiritual experiences and pitifully pretend that our world has no spiritual depths, and will do so out of grief and fear of the uncertainties that result when these experiences no longer enjoy supernatural authorization. Alternatively, if we learn to appreciate the meaning and value of religious and spiritual experiences, even after knowledge overcomes ignorance of their workings, and even after supernaturalism fades away, then a whole new adventure begins. Our cognitive deficits are almost irresistible. So a collapse of civilization would cause us to revert to default supernaturalist readings of religious and theological experiences. Do you follow that? Our evolutionary cognitive heritage is so strong that without education, without structures of illumination, take away all of that, we immediately revert to supernaturalist modes of explanation. That's our equipment. But if enlightened religious wisdom traditions persist, if science remains balanced by humanities and the arts, if we continue to educate one another about what we discover about all dimensions of the world, then we can learn to control those cognitive liabilities that continually give rise to supernaturalism. At the same time, we will be warranted in affirming the meaning and value of some religious and spiritual experiences, particularly those intense versions of ordinary experience that help us to detect the dimensions of depth, horizon, scale, complexity and mystery within natural reality that we discussed in a previous lecture. Such experiences are indicators of the aesthetic, moral, conceptual and spiritual richness of human life in its wondrous natural environment. So what I have described is a possible future for human beings. It is a future that promises greater awareness of cognitive error and avoidance of errors deriving from supernaturalist reflexes. It is a future that promises a decisive decline in the extreme violence and irrationality that religious and spiritual experiences so easily spark and rationalize. It is a future in which religious and spiritual experiences can increase appreciation of the wonders of our natural environment and of experiential and religious diversity. It is, in short, a future that I will welcome with open arms. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Professor Wildman. As with our previous lectures, we have time for some questions, and we are recording the entire evening for our archives. So I ask that you wait until the microphone is actually in your hands before you start to speak.
Thank you very much for this lecture. Is this on? And for the series of lectures. Once you understand the causes, it all works better, doesn't it? Yes. Thank you, as I say, for the lecture and for the series of lectures. In past lectures, you've defined spiritual experiences in terms of being experiences of ultimacy. And in the latter part of this lecture, you defined religious and spiritual experiences as revealing the depths of things, depths of nature. And both of those are intentional stances. And yet when you describe the botanicals and their experiences and the special social circumstances and meditative practices, you describe mainly the feelings without any kind of intentional stance. How can you tell when the feelings really are feelings of ultimacy or depths?
That's a multi-leveled question, isn't it? We're talking about how to assess actual reports. I take it. It's possible to sit in your bathtub and theorize about these things, but in the end, you're actually going to have to talk to people about religious and spiritual experiences to see what significance they attach to them. And what significance they attach to them will not immediately support any one integrative theory of them that you have. In my particular case, holding a naturalistic framework for interpreting them, I need to take a second step, which is to use a theory of symbolism that links what people say is the significance of their experience to what I take to be, for other reasons, the actual reference of the languages and the symbols that they use. That is, I need to join careful discussions with people who go through these experiences with a theoretical apparatus that allows me to interpret what I hear and to connect those stories together. Now, that's a philosophical impulse to look for a connected interpretation. An anthropologist might be horrified by that. What they may prefer is simply a rich description, a thick description of lots of different individuals, or even just a few individuals. I value that also. But as a philosopher, I'm entitled to ask the question about what does it all add up to? And if the anthropologist or the sociologist wants to stop short of asking that question, that's fine. But they can't rule out the possibility of my answering it. So it's a two-step process.
I'm mostly interested in what you see these other collections, the collections of religious technology that are already up and running, the major world religious traditions, what you see their role being. I can imagine some Zen Buddhists who might be excited about the possibility of these sort of new technologies for bringing about sort of sudden enlightenment. But I'm having trouble sort of projecting decades ahead to seeing the role of Christianity and Judaism and these other longer traditions. If you could, I would ask you to sort of work them into this imaginative narrative for a moment.
Thank you, Dr. Brandon Daniel Hughes. appreciate that question. What were we asking just then? Were you asking about how the technologies go forward or how the religious traditions go forward? Second, yeah. So how do religious traditions go forward? This is a deeply puzzling question. I imagine that religious traditions, being as diverse and multifocal as they are, will go forward on all sides of the issue at once as usual, right? They're on all sides of every social issue you can think of, from abortion to the war. They're on all sides of every moral question, of every political question. They'll be on all sides of this one, and they'll be all over it with enormous resistance and enormous enthusiasm. So that's a short answer to a long and complicated question. But there are Christian churches right now in Boston that use LSD as their weekly sacrament, right? It's illegal. They don't like people knowing about it unless you want to join them. They're always eager to recruit. But they exist, and that's an example of a Christian sect which is embracing this new world eagerly, even protesting against government restrictions on drugs. That will just expand enormously, I expect. At the same time, the defence of supernatural worldviews will be understood as essential because everything about this threatens them. This is what I consider real-life falsification of a metaphysical system. It's not decisive falsification. You can hold out forever if you want to stay a supernaturalist, but it gets harder and harder, and therefore the resistance gets fiercer and fiercer, more and more withdrawing into enclaves, basically, and refusing engagement with the wider culture. Much has happened with fundamentalism in the 20th century in relation to things like historical criticism and so on. So that's how I think it'll go down. I think every tradition will go down that way.
I'm sorry I missed your earlier lectures. If you're going to study religious experience, how do you differentiate between an ordinary hallucination and one that's a spiritual or religious hallucination? Is it just the subjective self-report? Is it the content? How do you get a handle on something like that?
Right. That's a brilliant and practical question. If any of you have had hallucinations, and actually most of the population has, it's a vital question. My answer is that it doesn't really matter to have a sharp way of distinguishing between hallucinations that are somehow specially authentic, religious, and hallucinations that are not. Why? Why doesn't it matter? Because to want such a distinction is to search for some kind of crisp and certain foundation for religious and spiritual experiences that just does not exist. It's not within our reach. So it becomes more a matter of art. It becomes a matter of how you deploy these experiences, what group you choose to share with them, whether you can find people who will give you the proper guidance to tell you when you're losing your balance, right? When you're staying on track. That is, to help you with discernment. And people who are going to tell you, look, your behaviour is changing. There's something wrong with what's going on here. You're not healthy anymore. Right? So health effects and also behavioural effects. Someone who encouraged you said, it's amazing, you're becoming so much more compassionate. What's that about? It's these kinds of considerations that feed into the artistic judgments we make about the sorts of experiences we have and how to regard them as the extent to which they are religious and spiritual, and the senses in which they are. Thanks, Jenny.
One of the things that, as you know, has been attributed to spiritual and religious experiences is a conveying of a moral valence and a moral compass. What, in the way you're describing, I know you're talking about a sense of deep connection with a natural world, but what about the spiritual and religious experiences as you're describing them ends up having an inherent sort of moral valence and moral dimension that would not simply be carryovers from the systems you're saying will fall away, but rather in and of themselves will bring about that kind of sort of inner alignment?
That's a beautiful question, isn't it? Isn't that a question we care deeply about? I mean, can you engage the world through your religious and spiritual experiences and encounter a moral orientation that can be decisive for your life? The answer clearly is yes, practically, because it happens all the time. But there's an intellectual problem there, because people draw different moral orientations from their religious and spiritual experiences. So there's, again, a two-leveled answer to that. From my point of view, if you have an experience of what in earlier lectures I called scale, when you lose track of where the edges of your identity are and you feel like you're merging with the rest of nature, the natural reaction to that, which has been demonstrated over and over again and is actually a centerpiece of certain kinds of Buddhist meditation, is karuna, or compassion. That compassion is so strongly supported by your experience, which feels so wonderful and so incredibly compelling, that it changes your behaviour. It changes the way you act towards animals, to neighbours, on the road, even when you're driving. And in Boston, that's a non-trivial accomplishment, right? So there are those kinds of things. Now, then there's the question about philosophically evaluating that particular moral norm of compassion, right? Whenever I think of moral norms, I think of my friend Norm Faramelli, who's actually an ethicist. Moral norms. A moral norm? Philosophically evaluating moral norms is incredibly complicated, and I'm afraid the answer I'm about to give you will not please you. I fear, anyway, that it will not please you. I don't think there are any decisive criteria for guaranteeing the rightness of a moral norm absolutely. When we engage in self-destructive behaviours, when we engage in violent behaviours, we participate in a real possibility which is afforded us within nature. It's what Paul Tillich called the demonic, by which he meant structures of destruction that are present within nature. But at the same time, we can engage other things positively, such as compassion. All of these things are possible. In theistic language, all of them are parts of the character of God, the moral character of God. So then you would have to say that God is beyond good and evil. And if that resonates with you in a literary context at all, you know that that's a reference to one of Nietzsche's arguments in one of his books, in which he tried to argue that whatever ultimate reality is, it has to lie beyond human categories of good and evil. And I think our experience and the character of our philosophical argument confirms that over and over again. Now that causes many young people who start to realise this to fall into a kind of paralysis. They get miserable, they fall into despair, they become relativists. In fact, that is a kind of escapism. What's required, according to Nietzsche, according to me, and according to other people, is responsibility in the face of this. That is, you must construct your life. You should choose deliberately. You should experience as much of the world as you can. Have experiences of compassion and see if your desire, your desires to destroy other people can survive that wonderful experience of compassion. Experiment. So what I'm describing is an experimental morality that leads out, hopefully, into some kind of consensus among groups, maybe even a global consensus, at least on certain points. And I would say that the human rights dialogue that's happening all over the world at the moment is actually an example of a global, cross-cultural, cross-religious consensus on certain moral norms. The same thing can be true of, can be said of care of the earth. But that's not something that we get by reading off moral commands from a divine being, in my view. It's something that we get at by exploring the world around us. Behind you, Brian.
Your answer about compassion might have already addressed what I want to ask, but I'm thinking of the rise of Pentecostalism in the two-thirds world, and especially the elevation of women's agency through manifestations of the supernatural. So does what you're offering, I'm just wondering about your thoughts, does it totally kind of wipe out that liberating movement, or is there anything to offer for it? Does it just create more of a dichotomy between us and them for these people who can't, you know, we kind of have this intellectual privilege, so if they can't have that, what then? What do we say?
Yep. Look, I'll go on record very bluntly and very directly saying this, that I'm a person of privilege. I exploit that privilege as a philosopher. I work hard to take that privilege seriously. And if I had to choose between keeping my freedom and achieving liberation for the oppressed, I would clearly choose liberation for the oppressed, even if it meant I had to simulate being a supernaturalist for the rest of my life. So they're my moral priorities. So then we're faced with a puzzle. How do you construe the people who disagree with you, who cannot afford this kind of luxury worldview, and who leverage the worldviews they have for the purposes of social justice? And I can only say, keep going. Social justice is more important than ontology. So keep fighting for whatever you need to do. And when you start fighting with each other, then hopefully people like me will have enough wisdom to step in and force you to stop fighting, because that's the downside of those very same enthusiasms. Those enthusiasms produce liberation and they produce violence. Same kind of background of experiences. So we want to encourage part of it, discourage others. Now, who's doing the encouragement? Who's doing the discouraging? Well, it's privileged philosophers like me, apparently, at least in this moment, in this sentence, in this paragraph. And I don't know what to say about that. There is, in any philosophical interpretation of the whole, a kind of condescension that rates certain people's experiences as more accurate than others. But I find myself judging differently in different respects. More accurate in ontology, I'd give the prize to one group, right? More faithful in terms of working on behalf of the moral norms that I care about, they get the prize. It's another group, right? So I think condescension is coped with, first by noticing one's own location and trying to be clear about it and taking responsibility for it, and secondly, by not oversimplifying the complexity of the world, noticing that there are lots and lots of respects in which we fight for things that matter to us, and realising that some people are better than that at others. And in this particular case, in this particular case, some of the people best at working for liberation and transformation of social conditions are supernaturalists with whom I disagree ontologically. But I don't mind working with them on their social issues, so long as they're prepared to have a happy naturalist in their midst.
I think we have time for one final question.
Hi.
Would you say that through finding biological causes for religious experiences, you could unite all religions? I mean, this is like la-di-da, happy world. But you could unite everybody in finding actual proof that we're all human and we all have the same bodies and we're all living things. So showing people that, well, this is the reason that you feel close to God on this part of the world, and this is the reason you feel close to God on this part of the world. Why are you fighting?
Yeah, beautiful. Look, structuralism is unfashionable still. The post-structuralists in philosophy and literary theory have those structuralists in a lockhold, right? So it's very unfashionable to say that human beings have common features across cultures. But I want to say it's obviously the case that human beings have common features across cultures. And their brains, for one thing, are shared across cultures. Their cognitive reflexes are the same. It's been tested culture after culture after culture. Their linguistic reflexes are the same. And yet, if you get carried away with pointing out how everything's the same, then you wind up missing out on all the good stuff. What's the good stuff? The good stuff is the incredible intricacy with which people engage the world. And for that, they use these wonderfully engineered societies and family systems and personal histories. I'm unwilling to give up any of it. So when it comes to trying to help people get along, I will point out that, hey, we've got the same kinds of impulses. We've got the same kind of basic physiological needs. Our cultures, with different answers, are answering the same kinds of questions. I'll point all of that out. And then I'd also point out what we really need to do is to encounter the other in each other. What matters most in my learning to be compassionate is discovering that you're not the same as me, right? And appreciating that difference to the point that I can actually claim the difference, not just the similarity, for my own. So how do you get a happy world? What did you call it? A happy la-di-da world? Yeah. I think differences matter just as much as similarities for producing such a world. And that's exactly why it's so difficult to get to.
I agree.
Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Wildman, for a great lecture and a great year of lectures. And thank you all for coming.